There are nights in the desert when silence weighs more heavily than any chain. Nights when the hot wind carries the scent of dry earth and fear, and the guards whisper among themselves about when someone's last sunrise will be. But there are also nights when the impossible happens, when forces no one expected appear out of nowhere, guided by signs that seem like miracles. My name is Josué da Silva. I'm 32 years old, born in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and spent 12 days chained in an abandoned shack on the edge of the Sahara. I waited for an execution that never came. And it's about this wait, this feeling of absolute abandonment, that I want to talk about. Because true faith isn't measured in the quiet days, but in the moments when you keep believing even when the world seems to have forgotten you. But before the desert, the chains, and the miracle that changed my life, there was an existence too ordinary to notice God's call. I grew up in a simple Christian family. My father was a mechanic. My mother sold candy at the neighborhood market. On Sundays, we went to the evangelical church, in a small building with peeling walls and barely functioning fans. There, amidst off-key hymns and sermons slurred by the heat, I heard for the first time that God doesn't call the qualified, but equips the called. At the time, that phrase was just a nice one. I lived a practical life. I studied accounting, got a stable job, lived in a modest apartment, and dated someone with whom we discussed predictable plans. The comfortable routine gave me a sense of life, but deep down, it was just breathing. Until God decided to shatter my security in a way I never expected. It was a Tuesday in April 2022. After work, I stopped by the church to help organize clothing donations. It was there that I met Pastor Elias, a 60-year-old man with weather-beaten hands and eyes that carried stories from distant worlds. He had just returned from a mission in Niger, a country I barely knew existed. "It's the hardest place I've ever been," he said, as we folded worn shirts. "The heat is consuming, water is scarce, and talking about Jesus can cost everything. But Joshua, I've never seen such a hunger for hope. Children walking miles to learn to read. Mothers sharing their last rations of food with strangers. People who have next to nothing but would give anything to hear that they're not alone." He looked me in the eye and said something that changed my life. "We need people willing to go where others won't." That night, I couldn't sleep. The pastor's words echoed in my head like an insistent drum. I opened the map on my phone and found Niger, a country between the Sahara and the Sahel, marked by poverty, conflict, and drought, where faith was a matter of survival, not just ritual. Something inside me awakened. For 3 weeks, I prayed silently, asking God for a sign, a confirmation that I wasn't dreaming too big. And the answer came unexpectedly. My girlfriend broke up with me. She said I had changed, that my conversations were about things too big for our small lives. She was right. I had changed, and it was the first time in years that I felt God was truly calling me to something bigger. I felt truly alive for the first time. A week later, I quit my job. My parents cried, telling me I was wasting my life, that the world was full of people who needed security and comfort. They were right in a way, but I knew something had shifted inside me. I understood for the first time that comfort is not a gift. It's a trap that numbs the soul. In August 2022, after months of preparation with an independent missionary organization, I boarded a plane in São Paulo, bound for Niamey, the capital of Niger. I wasn't alone. With me were Marcos, a nurse from Recife accustomed to crisis zones, and Deborah, a strong teacher fluent in French. 3 strangers united by a certainty. God had called us to go. The flight lasted 14 hours with layovers, but nothing could prepare me for the shock of Africa. As I opened the plane door in Niamey, the heat hit us like an invisible fist. It wasn't the humid heat of Brazil, but a dry, relentless heat that steals your breath and dries your throat in seconds. The sky was a piercing blue, cloudless, and the air smelled of dust, heated metal, and something primal, untamed. We spent 2 days in Niamey gathering supplies, sacks of rice, basic medicines, Bibles in Jausa and Sarma, and teaching materials. Then a rickety truck took us north toward Agadez. 11 hours of travel on roads that could barely be called roads, amidst dust, rocks, and a seemingly endless expanse of sand. Gradually, the sparse acacia trees gave way to absolute nothingness. The Sahara is not just a desert. It is living proof that the world can be both beautiful and deadly at the same time. When we arrived in Agadez, the sun was already setting on the horizon, tinting the dunes orange and purple. The city was a maze of adobe and narrow alleys, mosques with minarets piercing the sky, markets selling everything from dates to rusted vehicle parts. The air was constantly redolent of spices, leather, and burnt oil. We were welcomed into a small house on the outskirts, provided by a local contact. 3 windowless rooms with a tin roof that turned the interior into an oven during the day. But we had water, food, and most importantly, purpose. That first night, we sat on the patio under a starry sky unlike anything I'd ever seen in Brazil. Thousands of points of light, stardust scattered across the infinite void. "Do you think it was a good idea to come?" Deborah asked softly. Marco smiled and responded with just a look. "I think it was the only idea that made sense." I didn't say anything, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fear and peace at the same time. Fear, because that place could destroy us. Peace, because we were exactly where we were supposed to be. We didn't know that, in less than 3 months, that starry sky would be the last thing we saw before everything fell apart. The first days in Agadez were a lesson in humility, disguised as extreme heat. We woke before dawn, when the air was still cool. But by 6 in the morning, the sun had become a red-hot iron above our heads, a constant reminder that we were in a different world, cruel and yet full of beauty, that only those who surrender to the call can see. In the desert, learning to live is learning to obey the sun. At age 10, walking under it was already a risk, and we adults learned quickly. Life here isn't organized around human desires, but rather the merciless rhythm of the heat. Our work seemed simple in theory, but in practice it was a constant test of patience, creativity, and faith. We came to serve, not to impose. The organization that sent us was clear. Be light in deeds, not just in words. The Bible speaks for itself when hunger subsides, and children learn to read. We set up a small community center in the shade of some date palms on the outskirts of Agadez, near a neighborhood where Tuareg and Josué families lived in mud houses with thatched roofs. The place had no official name. To the locals, it was simply the place for friendly foreigners. Deborah taught literacy classes 3 times a week. The children arrived barefoot, with torn clothes and huge, curious eyes. They sat on straw mats, and she drew the French alphabet in the sand with twigs. Some were 6, others 12. None had ever attended a real school. Marco set up a small medical clinic. He treated infected wounds, treated dehydration, and distributed tablets for intestinal parasites. It wasn't a hospital, but in a place where the nearest health clinic was over 100 kilometers away, a clean gauze pad and antiseptic could mean the difference between life and death. I was in charge of food distribution. Every Thursday and Sunday we opened bags of rice, lentils, vegetable oil, and millet flour. Entire families lined up in silence. They never pressured, never demanded. They waited with a patience that tugged at the heartstrings. There was an elderly man named Ibrahim, a Tuareg with a white beard and trembling hands, who came every week with his 2 orphaned grandchildren. He always greeted me in French. "May Allah bless your hands, my Brazilian brother." I never corrected him. Love needs no correction, only constant presence. Over time, the conversations deepened. After distributing food, some would gather under the palm trees, and we would sit in a circle to talk about life, pain, hope, and, inevitably, about Jesus. We didn't preach with megaphones. We told stories of a God who became man to be close to suffering, not distant from it. That there was a carpenter who knew sweat and hunger, and that God's love was more powerful than any weapon. I remember Amina, a young 23-year-old mother whose husband had disappeared months earlier in an attack by armed groups. She arrived with her baby strapped to her back, and one day, after receiving her rations, she stood silently before me. "Are you okay?" I asked in French. "Your God," she replied, her voice breaking. He especially listens to widows. A lump formed in my throat. I gave her a small Josué Bible. I never knew if she read it, but I know she came back every week. Not just for food, but for something deeper, something only God could fulfill. Perhaps you too know someone like Amina, someone who needed to hear that God hadn't forgotten her. Or perhaps you were that person for someone. Small actions, gestures of presence and love can change eternal destinies. Never underestimate that. For a while, it seemed like everything was working. We were discreet, respectful, and helpful. We managed to exist in that delicate balance between serving and witnessing without attracting attention. But we were being watched. The first clue came one October afternoon. A young man in a dark tunic and blue turban stood at the edge of the community center all day. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just watched us. Marcos was the first to notice. "Look," he whispered. "You've been here for 2 hours." Deborah had seen him too. And then we realized he came every day at the same time, silent and still. I tried not to show fear, but I felt a chill run down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the scorching heat of the Sahara. That night, in our makeshift home, we discussed what to do. Should we keep a low profile? Stop talking about Jesus? Leave? But we knew deep down we couldn't. Not now. Not after seeing the sparkle in Amina's eyes when she heard that God listened to widows. Not after watching the children learn to write their names in the sand. "If God has brought us this far," said Mark, "He will also sustain us." For a few weeks, we clung to this faith. But rumors began to spread in the markets, in the mosques, in the evening conversations over tea. They said foreigners were bringing a forbidden religion, that we were corrupting Muslims, that we were agents of the West disguised as goodness. We didn't know what awaited us, but the clock had already begun counting down. Thursday, November 17th, 2022, dawned like any other day in Agades. The sky was blue and clear, the heat rising from the sand as if it had a life of its own. We prepared for the weekly food distribution under the palm trees. There were no signs, no omens, just an ordinary day that was about to become the worst of our lives. We arrived at the community center at 7 a.m. About 30 people were waiting for us. Mothers with babies, elderly people leaning on canes, barefoot children playing in the sand. Ibrahim was there, as always, holding his grandchildren's hands. Amina arrived early, with her baby sleeping on her back. Deborah organized the lines, while Marcos and I unloaded the bags of rice from the small rented truck. The air smelled of dry earth and palm oil, and some women sang a Tuareg melody that drifted on the wind. All seemed peaceful. That's why we only heard the engines when it was too late. 3 battered Toyota pickup trucks emerged from the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that blotted out the sun. They screeched to a halt just a few meters away. The doors opened, and 8 men armed with assault rifles stepped out, turbans covering their faces, leaving only their eyes visible. The singing ceased. The children stopped playing. The silence that fell over the community center was so thick, it felt like it touched the skin, suffocating, laden with threat and fear. One of them, taller than the others, with visible scars on his hands, shouted something in Josué that I couldn't fully understand. But a few key words were clear: foreigners, corrupt, enemies of Islam. Deborah instinctively backed away. Marcos raised his hands in a sign of peace. "We don't want any trouble," he said firmly in French, but his voice trembled. "We're just helping." The tall man approached and slammed the butt of his rifle into Marcos's face. He fell to his knees, his mouth bleeding. Deborah screamed. I lunged forward, but before I could take a step, I felt the cold barrel of a gun press against the back of my neck. "Don't move," a hoarse voice said in French behind me. Panic ensued. Women ran, carrying their children, and elderly men tried to get away. Ibrahim shouted something in Tamashek, probably begging for us, but one of the men violently pushed him to the ground. His grandchildren cried, clinging to him. We were forced to kneel beside Marcos and Deborah. They tied our hands behind our backs with rough ropes that cut into our skin. The tall man walked in front of us with slow, almost theatrical steps, speaking loudly so everyone could hear. "These are the ones who come to destroy our faith," he shouted in Jausa, then in French to us. "They come with food, with medicine, with smiles, but they bring poison, the religion of the infidels, and they must pay for it." A strong blow to my back knocked me face down. I swallowed sand. I felt the weight of a boot on my neck. Panic turned to absolute terror. I could die there, in the dust, far from my family, without understanding why God had brought us to this place. Still, we weren't executed immediately. They hadn't dragged us to the trucks yet. Marcos was bleeding from the nose and mouth. Deborah was crying silently, her eyes wide open. I was shoved like a sack into the back of one of the trucks. The metal burned in the sun. My skin burned from the contact. Before the door closed, I saw Amina in the scattered crowd, hands over her mouth, tears in her eyes. Our eyes met for a second, an eternal second. Then the door closed, and everything went dark. The journey was torture. The trucks chugged along non-existent roads, bouncing over rocks and loose sand. Each bump was a blow, each thud a warning of impending despair. It was a silent, desperate prayer. Marcos moaned in pain. Deborah murmured barely audible verses. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I couldn't speak. My mouth was full of blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. I could only think about my parents, about the last time I'd hugged them at the São Paulo airport, about how my mother cried, and how my father would say, "Be careful, son." At the time, I responded with youthful arrogance, "God will take care of me." Now those words sounded like a cruel mockery of fate. I don't know how much time had passed. 2 hours? 4? Time slips away when the body is on the verge of collapse. Finally, the truck stopped. They dragged us out. I opened my eyes, squinting against the sun, and saw absolute nothingness. Sand rippling to the horizon, no trees, no shadows, and before us, the remains of an abandoned village. 5 ruined adobe huts, rotting thatched roofs, walls with holes like empty eye sockets. They led us to the largest of them. The interior smelled of death, of dead animals, of urine, of ancient despair. Rusty chains were nailed to the wooden pillars. I realized with horror that this place had been used before. Others had been here. Others had suffered here. They tied us separately. I was chained to a pillar in the right corner. Marcos was in the center. Deborah was in the opposite corner. The chains were heavy, ancient, with dark stains I preferred not to identify. The tall man crouched before me. His breath smelled of bitter tea and tobacco. "You'll stay here until we decide what to do with you," he said calmly. "You can pray to your God all you want. Let's see if he hears you in this hell." He laughed. The others laughed too. Then they left, closed the wooden door, and locked the bolt. Silence. Just our breathing. The clanking of chains and the wind whistling through the cracks in the adobe were now our symphony. Deborah broke the silence. "Joshua, God knows where we are." I wanted to respond with faith, with something pastoral, profound, hopeful, but I could only whisper the raw truth. "I don't know, Deborah. I don't know." Outside, we heard the men's voices, their laughter, the crackling of a fire. Beyond, the deathly silence of the Sahara swallowed all the screams. That was our first night in chains, the first of 12 that would seem eternal. On the first day, I learned that the human body can scream without making a sound. As the sun reached its zenith, the hut became a furnace. The thatched and adobe roof trapped the heat like a death trap. The air was so thick and hot that breathing hurt. Each breath burned my throat. Each breath burned my lungs. The chains became so hot they touched my skin like branding irons. I tried to move away from the pillar, but the range was minimal. 2 feet, barely enough to lie on my side. Marcos moaned in the center of the cabin. Deborah had stopped talking. Sweat soaked our clothes, but it wasn't relief. It was just our bodies losing water we couldn't replenish. My tongue swelled, my lips cracked. Thirst isn't just discomfort. It's a torment that occupies every thought, every second, until the only thing left in the world is words. Water. In the afternoon, one of the guards came in. Young, maybe 19, his face still lacking the desert tan. He carried a tin bowl of murky water. "Just one," he said in French. "Share it." He set it down on the floor in the center, equidistant from the 3 of us, but out of reach. Marcos, his hands free but his legs chained, crawled as best he could and grabbed the bowl. He took 2 sips, then crawled toward me and held it close. The water tasted of earth, of metal, of despair, but it was the most sacred thing I had ever tasted. I took 3 sips, and then carried the bowl to Deborah. She emptied it. There was nothing left, but it didn't matter. For 5 minutes, hell had stopped. Those 5 minutes were the only good thing about the first day. At night, when the heat finally faded, the cold set in with a vengeance. The desert knows no middle ground. During the day, it burns. At night, it freezes. We shivered uncontrollably, our sweat-soaked clothes now ice-cold against our skin. In the pitch black, the silence was broken only by the sounds from outside. Guards chatted around a fire, fragments of words reaching us. State, infidels, cattle. words laden with menace, but whose full meaning I preferred not to decipher. They laughed, they argued, and sometimes one of them would enter with a flashlight, illuminating us for a few seconds as if we were animals in a zoo, before disappearing again. Deborah was the first to speak that night. Out loud she prayed, "Heavenly Father, we don't understand why we are here. We don't understand your plan, but we trust. We trust even when all seems lost. We trust even when our bodies cry out, 'Deliver us, Lord,' or give us strength to endure whatever comes." Marcos and I said, "Amen," but inside, I felt my faith shatter, like glass under pressure. The second day brought new pains. We were given only half a bowl of water, no food. Hunger has a strange way of setting in. First it hurts, then it disappears, replaced by a nauseating emptiness that seems to squeeze the stomach like a fist. Weakness sets in slowly, but relentlessly. Marcos developed a fever, and the wound on his face, inflicted by the rifle butt, became infected. I begged for medicine, bandages, any help. The young guard looked at me as if I'd asked for the impossible. "You won't need them," he said dismissively. On the third day, Deborah stopped praying aloud. I only murmured, sometimes in Portuguese, sometimes in languages I didn't recognize. Her lips moved soundlessly. That terrified me more than any pain. Seeing someone as steadfast as Deborah break was a clear sign that we were on the brink of the end. The days began to blur together. Time lost its meaning. Day 4, 5, 6. I don't know. Here, hell isn't measured in hours but in levels of suffering. Each dawn was a countdown to something inevitable we dared not name. I believe it was on the 7th day. One of the guards pointed at Marcos with contempt. "This one won't last long," he said in French to another. Marcos could barely open his eyes. His breathing was noisy and labored. The infection was advancing, half of his face swollen and red. I knew that without antibiotics and clean water, he was losing the battle. "Hang in there, brother," I whispered that night. "Please, hang in there." He looked at me with glassy eyes and murmured, "What for, Josué? So they can take us all together until the end." I had no answer. On the 8th day, I had a hallucination. I saw my mother at the entrance of the house, wearing a flowered apron, calling for dinner. I saw the Copacabana sea, waves crashing on the sand. I saw my father in the workshop, wiping his hands with a greasy cloth, smiling at me. "Dad!" I whispered, but he wasn't there. Only the warmth, only the emptiness, only the currents that stopped hurting because my body seemed to no longer feel anything. Deborah began to sing hymns softly. Her voice, fragile and almost muffled, carried an unexpected beauty. It was her soul speaking, reminding me that, even in extreme pain, God was still with us. Even as my body was crumbling, I tried to keep up, but I didn't even have the strength. It was on the 9th day that I heard something that changed everything. It was late, and the evening light filtered through the cracks in the adobe in orange layers. The guards were arguing outside, closer to the gate than usual. I recognized the voice of the tall man, the leader. "Enough," he said in French, probably so we could understand. "Tomorrow we'll record the video, and the day after tomorrow we'll take you to the wadi and finish this." Another replied in Jausa that I didn't understand, but the leader was clear. "I don't care. The orders are clear. Infidels don't leave the Sahara alive." Silence. Then laughter. Deborah glanced at me sideways. Her eyes were sunken, her lips cracked and bleeding, but there was a terrible clarity there, the certainty that we would probably leave this world. I whispered to her, "Are you afraid?" "Very," she replied with brutal honesty. "Me too." Marcos said nothing. He just closed his eyes. On the 10th night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound was a threat, every shadow a tormentor. I mentally replayed my entire life. Mistakes, successes, loved ones, wasted opportunities. I wondered if everything I'd experienced would be worth it if those months in Agadez ended like this, chained in the middle of the desert. For the first time in 10 days, I prayed angrily, not with submission or acceptance, but with pure fury. "God, if you exist, if you truly brought us here, then answer. Why? For what? So we can disappear into nothingness. So our families never know what happened to us. So Amina will think you've abandoned us too." Silence. Only the night wind whistled through the cracks. Have you ever yelled at God like that? Without pretending? Just pouring out anger and fear? It's brutal,
but it's also prayer.
The 11th day was the hottest of all, or perhaps my body could no longer process the temperature. Marcos was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. Deborah didn't speak, and I wavered between wakefulness and fainting. In the afternoon, the leader entered with 3 men, each carrying a small camera. "Tomorrow at dawn," he said, looking me in the eye, "I will show that you are spies, come to destroy Islam." Then he gestured with his hand to his neck. They laughed and left. That was our last night, our 12th. I knew it with every fiber of my exhausted body. As total darkness fell, without the strength to even fear, I closed my eyes and whispered a final prayer. Not in anger this time, but in absolute surrender. "Father, if this is the end, let it be quick. But if there's still a plan, if there's still a chance for us to get out of here, use anything. Use the wind, use the desert, use invisible armies, because we have nothing left." The wind blew hard that night, and the sand beat against the adobe walls like invisible fingers, trying to touch us. The guards whispered around the fire. One of them muttered something that sounded like, "Bakra tomorrow." Tomorrow. It was the last word that echoed to us. The 12th night began like all the others, with the certainty that we would never see another dawn. The bonfire burned brighter than usual, casting dancing shadows against the dunes, shadows that seemed to laugh at our helplessness. One of the men sharpened a knife. The metallic sound as it struck the stone was hypnotic and terrifying. Marcos was breathing heavily, each sigh seeming to tear the silence. Deborah had been motionless for hours. For a moment I thought she was already gone, but then I saw the gentle rise and fall of her chest. I myself was in a strange state. I no longer felt the chains, no longer thirsty. My body had shut down, entering something I can only call anesthesia before collapse. Only my mind remained, floating between wakefulness and hallucination. I closed my eyes and prayed, not with pretty words or doctrines, but with the rawest, most honest despair a human being can feel. God, if you've ever heard me, if you've ever been here, I need you now. I have nothing to offer, no courage, no virtues, just fear and a broken body. I opened my eyes. Everything seemed the same. Shadows, the sound of the knife, the wind whistling through the cracks. Maybe 30 minutes had passed, maybe an hour. Time no longer had any meaning, but something changed. The guards began arguing louder, their voices thick with nervousness. One of them pointed toward the dark horizon. I sat up, leaning against the pillar, and tried to see. At first I saw nothing but the outline of the dunes against the starry sky. Then I heard it, a distant, deep, mechanical sound. Engines. I thought it was a hallucination, another cruel trick of the weary mind. But the sound grew louder, closer, real. The guards heard it too. Their voices grew high-pitched, nervous. Orders began to be shouted, hurried footsteps, weapons being loaded, metal clashing. "What is this?" whispered Deborah, barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, "but it's coming this way." And then I saw it. Lights, headlights cutting through the desert darkness like white blades. The guards panicked, running, shouting, but they didn't fire. The lights were advancing too fast, too organized. They weren't bandits. It was the army. Military vehicles invaded the camp, kicking up clouds of sand that shone gold in the intense light. 3 camouflaged tactical trucks, with armed soldiers in the back, surrounded them with the precision and silence of those who already knew what to do. The guards didn't wait to negotiate. They fled. They ran for their trucks, leaving everything behind. Their fire, their weapons, their equipment. Their engines roared, their tires dug into the sand, and in less than 30 seconds, they had vanished into the darkness like ghosts. Not a shot, not a word, just the absolute panic of men who knew they had lost. The soldiers surrounded the village with military precision. I heard orders in French, firm footsteps, the sound of boots on the sand echoing like silent thunder. Then, suddenly, the hut door opened. A beam of light blinded me. Instinctively, I raised my hand, but my strength was minimal. A soldier entered, saw the chains, and shouted something to the others. Here they are, 3 people in chains. 4 soldiers quickly followed. One of them knelt beside me, examining my chains with a small flashlight. "Calm down," he said in French. "You're safe now. Let's get you out of here." I managed to whisper to my comrades. "They're here. We can see them now." Calm down, breathe. Tools appeared, and the sound of metal cutting echoed. The most beautiful music I'd ever heard. As the last chain fell, I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't budge. I collapsed. 2 soldiers gently held me down. They freed Marcos, unconscious but breathing. They placed him on a makeshift stretcher. Deborah wept silently as they cut her chains. Tears mingled with the dust covering her face, but there was something hopeful in the gleam in her eyes. We left the hut. The desert night air, which had been our jailer for 12 days, now felt like a balm. I took a deep breath, so deep my lungs ached. An officer, uniform impeccable and insignia shining, approached. His face was serious, but not hostile. "Are you okay?" he asked in perfect French. "Alive," I replied, my voice breaking. "Thank God. Alive." The officer nodded. "We'll take you to Niamey. You need urgent medical attention." "Wait," I managed. "How did you find us?" The officer exchanged a look with another soldier who explained. "We received a report of a smoke signal in this sector. Our observation post on the hill to the north detected a column of white smoke visible for miles. That's what guided us here." My body shivered. "Smoke signal?" I repeated in my mind. No one had lit a fire here. Just that small fire the guards had started. How could it be? The officer frowned. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I managed to reply, still staggering. He then inspected the perimeter with his flashlight, and I followed, supported by another soldier. Every corner of the abandoned village was checked. The guards' fire still burned, almost extinguished, just a few red embers. There was no other sign. Nothing burned. No trace. The surrounding sand remained virgin. Nothing explained the alert. But at that moment, it didn't matter. We were alive. We were free. He turned to me, his expression confused. "That's impossible," our observer muttered. He'd seen the signal clearly. They'd even triangulated the position. That's how they'd arrived exactly there. "And there is nothing?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Nothing," he confirmed. It was as if the signal had appeared out of nowhere. We stared at each other in silence. In his eyes, I saw the same bewilderment I felt. But there was something more. The recognition that we had just witnessed something no human reasoning could explain. "Get in the truck," he said finally. "You need to rest." They led us to the military truck. I sat next to Deborah, wrapped in a thermal blanket. Marcos was already being treated by a paramedic. An IV was installed, the wound cleaned, and antibiotics administered. I just stared at the abandoned village disappearing into the darkness, the exact spot from which the impossible smoke signal had originated. Deborah took my hand, trembling. "Joshua, did you hear what the soldier said?" "Yes." "You think so?" I replied before she could finish. "I believe God used the desert wind exactly as I asked. I don't know how, I don't know why, but no human being lit that signal." She cried. So did I. Tears that were not of pain, but of something greater, something that has no name in any human tongue. The truck advanced through the nocturnal desert toward Niamey, toward life, toward a return that seemed impossible. And behind us, in the Sahara sands, the mystery remained. A smoke signal that no one lit, but everyone saw. A miracle that defies explanation. If you've ever witnessed something with no logical explanation, something that can only be called a miracle, share it. Stories like these build collective faith. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it. It might be exactly what they've been waiting for. The journey to Niamey lasted 6 hours that felt like 6 minutes. My exhausted body had forgotten how to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chains, heard the sound of the knife being sharpened, felt the unbearable heat of the shack. Trauma doesn't disappear when the danger ends. It merely changes form. Deborah remained awake throughout the trip, staring out the window of the military truck, as if afraid it was all just a dream from which she would wake back to hell. Sometimes she would squeeze my hand tightly to confirm that we were real. Marcos was still unconscious, but the paramedics assured us he would stabilize. His fever had gone down thanks to the intravenous antibiotics. His body had held up better than humanly expected. We arrived in Niamey at dawn. The city was slowly waking up. Vendors setting up their stalls, motorcycles whizzing along the dirt roads, the call to prayer echoing from the mosques. Everything so normal, and yet, at the same time, everything so different from what we had just experienced. We were taken directly to the military hospital, a 2-story building with peeling walls and barred windows, but clean and functional. For the first time in 12 days, we were free. The doctors welcomed us with professional efficiency, but also with genuine compassion. Marcos was immediately taken to the ICU. Deborah and I were admitted to the same ward, hooked up to intravenous drips, blood tests, inspection of every wound, every burn from the currents, every inch of skin damaged by the relentless Saharan sun. The diagnosis was clear: severe dehydration, acute malnutrition, multiple skin infections, profound psychological trauma. But we were alive. Against all odds, alive. I spent 3 days in that hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling, trying to process what had happened. The doctors told me I needed rest, but rest wouldn't come. Every time I fell asleep, I woke up screaming. The nurses came rushing in, soothing me with gentle words in French. I tried again, and the cycle repeated. Deborah was in the bed next to mine. She wasn't sleeping well either. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I'd hear her crying softly. Other times I'd pray quietly. But these were no longer the desperate prayers of the shack. They were prayers of broken gratitude, coming from someone who had touched the abyss and returned transformed. On the 4th day, Marcos woke up. His first word was water. They handed him a glass, and he drank slowly, as if each sip was sacred. Then he looked at Deborah and me. "We're alive," he said, his voice hoarse, needing confirmation. "Yes, brother," I replied. "We are alive." "We're alive," he repeated, in a deep cry that seemed to come from a place deeper than his lungs. Deborah stood up, limping, and hugged him. I joined her. The 3 of us embraced there, in the hospital room. 3 survivors, united by something no one else could understand. On the 5th day, the officer who rescued us came to visit. He brought documents, forms, and standard procedural questions. But he also brought something more, the answers we were seeking. "I did some research on the smoke signal," he said, sitting beside my bed. "I talked to the observer who reported it and the 2 soldiers at the post that night. They all saw the same thing, a clear, defined column of white smoke, visible for almost 20 minutes. And there was no source. They reviewed satellite images. Nothing. They physically checked the area the next day. No trace of combustion, no burned material. It was as if the signal had existed only to guide us, and then disappeared. Silence. "I'm not a religious man," the officer continued, "but I've been in the army for 15 years. I've seen strange things. This, however, has no logical explanation." "So what do you think it was?" asked Deborah. The officer looked at us. "I think you know better than I do." He was right. Deep down, where logic fails and only an inexplicable certainty remains, we knew exactly what had happened. A week later, the missionary organization that had sent us coordinated our return to Brazil. Marcos needed jaw surgery that could only be performed in São Paulo. Deborah's family was waiting for her, anxious, their hearts heavy with worry. I just wanted to get home, hug my parents, and feel safe somewhere. The flight back was surreal. 14 hours in the air, surrounded by a comfort that felt strange and distant after what we'd been through. Movies played on the screen in front of me, but my mind could barely keep up. The food tasted like cardboard, but for us, it was a feast compared to the bowl of dirty desert water. I stared out the window, watching the clouds, thinking about how fragile everything is, how life can change in an instant. When we landed on a gray Tuesday in December, I saw my parents behind the arrivals barriers. Something inside me finally gave in. My mother ran, crying, and my father, that man with calloused hands who rarely showed emotion, wept like a child. The 3 of us hugged right there, in the middle of the airport, as people walked by, unaware that they were standing before a living miracle. "We thought we lost you," my mother whispered, resting her head on my shoulder. "You were so close," I replied, my voice breaking. "So close, indeed. I want you, reading these lines from anywhere in the world, to know that these stories can cross borders and touch hearts in ways I never imagined. We are a global community united by faith and hope." The first few weeks in Brazil were difficult. Sleeping was nearly impossible. Closed spaces and loud noises made me panic. The therapist called it PTSD, but I thought, this is the price for having seen hell and managed to come back. However, there was something else growing inside me. a certainty. The certainty that my life was no longer my own, that I had been brought back for a greater purpose. I couldn't simply return to the comfortable, safe routine I'd left behind. 3 months later, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Pastor Elias, the man who had sent me to Niger. "Joshua, I need you to know something important," he said. It was about Amina, the young widow we had met in Agadez. She was alive. She had managed to escape with her baby, crossing the border into Chad, and now in a refugee camp. My heart raced. She was fine, but she needed help, just like thousands of others fleeing the same horror we know. I hung up the phone and knew exactly what I had to do. Today, 4 months after my rescue, I'm working on the Chad-Niger border with a humanitarian organization. I'm not back in Agadez. I may never return, but I'm close enough to serve those who still suffer. I saw Amina again. She holds the little Bible I gave her and still asks about the God who hears widows. And I answer, not with perfect doctrines, but with a broken, honest, lived testimony. The trauma still lingers. The scars visit me at night. I hear the sound of chains, feel the suffocating heat of the shack. But I also remember something extraordinary, a smoke signal no one lit, which appeared exactly when we needed it, guiding us toward life. And it is in this signal that my faith rests, steadfast, despite the fear and pain. I remember the headlights cutting through the endless darkness of the desert. I remember every minute chained, forgotten, lost, and yet God has not forgotten me. This memory sustains me to this day, even when everything around me seems to be falling apart. It's been 3 years since that night in the desert, 3 years since the army found us, guided by a sign no one could explain. 3 years since my chains fell off, and I learned that freedom doesn't mean the absence of pain, but the certainty that even in pain, we are never alone. Today, I'm 35 years old. I live in Musoro, Chad, in a modest adobe house, 300 kilometers from the Niger border. I work with a network of humanitarian organizations, serving refugees fleeing war, drought, and persecution. There are thousands of them, entire families walking under the scorching sun, carrying what little they could salvage. Children who have seen horrors no child should ever see. Mothers who travel miles in search of water that often doesn't exist. Our work goes beyond the basics: food, water, temporary shelter, and medical care. We also bring something more difficult to measure: hope. A hope that doesn't come from empty promises, but from real testimonies, from people who have been on the brink and returned. Amina is still in the nearby refugee camp. Her baby, Salifu, whom she was carrying on her back when we met in Agadez, is now 4 years old. He's a joyful boy with huge eyes, who runs between the tents chasing lizards and laughing loudly. 2 months ago, Amina made the decision to follow Jesus. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a slow process, full of difficult questions, genuine doubts, and sincere searching. When she finally dove into the murky waters of a nearby river for an impromptu baptism, she cried like I'd never seen her cry before. Tears that washed away something much deeper than the desert dust. "Now I understand," she told me, sitting in the shade of an acacia tree. He listens to widows, and not only listens, he walks with them. Marcos made a full recovery. The jaw surgery was a success. He returned to Recife and now works at a community hospital in the favelas. She writes to me every month, always ending with the same words: "Sometimes I still feel the chains, Joshua, but freedom weighs more heavily." Deborah also returned to her missions, but not in Africa. She now serves in the Amazon, working with isolated indigenous communities. She called me 3 weeks ago. "You know what's strange?" she asked. "I'm not afraid of anything anymore. After Agadez, everything else seems manageable. It's as if the desert has emptied me of fear and filled me with something else." "With what?" I asked. "Absolutely," he replied. "And that's exactly how I feel." The question I'm asked most often is always the same from new missionaries, volunteers, or people who read my testimony: "Would you return to Agadez?" And my answer never changes: yes, I would. Not because I'm brave, but because I know that God walks with us even when fear is alive, pulsing strongly in my chest. Every time I think of the adobe streets, the community center, the palm trees, the faces of the children learning to write in the sand, I would go back because I learned something in those 12 days in chains that no book or seminar can teach. I discovered that faith is not measured by the peaceful days, but by the days when you still believe, even when the world seems to have forgotten you, even when the chains cut into your skin, even when the water has run out, even when the guards argue about your last sunrise. True faith is not the absence of doubt, it is decision in the midst of it. And I decided, on the darkest night of my life, to pray for an impossible miracle. I asked God to use the desert wind to save us. And He answered in a way that defies all human logic. A smoke signal that no one lit, but everyone saw. That night taught me that God doesn't always calm the storm. Sometimes He holds us in the midst of it. Sometimes, when human resources are at their wits' end, He moves invisible armies on our behalf. That's why I would go back. Because now I know that even in the worst moment, we are not alone. The other day, a young refugee named Yusuf approached me after a food distribution. He had heard my story from someone in the camp. In halting French, he asked, "Is it true? Did God save you when you were in chains?" I replied, "It's true, but why do you want to know?" His question wasn't accusatory. It was filled with pain and curiosity. His family had prayed too. His father had cried out for help when the armed men invaded their village. But there was no rescue, no miracle. He was no longer here. "Why did God save you and not him?" he asked me. I remained silent. I have no answer to that question. It's the hardest question there is. The question that keeps people awake at night. The question that keeps me awake at night. I don't know, Yusuf. I don't know why I survived and others didn't. I don't understand God's criteria, nor His chronology. But I do know this. Your father's faith was not in vain. He didn't pray for nothing. And here you are. A different miracle, but real. Yusuf wept. So did I. There are unanswered questions, pains that cannot be explained, and losses that will never be fully healed. But there is also this: testimonies of those who have fallen and returned, smoke signals that appear when all hope seems lost, armies that arrive at exactly the right time, chains that break. And as long as these things exist, I will keep returning, not necessarily to Agadez, not yet, but to the borders, to the refugee camps, to the places where hope is scarce and despair abounds. There, I learned the true measure of faith. It's not tested on sunny days, nor in comfortable churches, nor when everything works as planned. It's tested in the shack, in the chains, in the suffocating heat, on the 12th night, when you know that at dawn everything could end. It's in that moment that you discover if you truly believe. I discovered that I believed, even without understanding, even screaming in rage, even thinking God had abandoned me. And that stubborn, broken, and desperate faith was enough to move the heavens. If this story brought even a glimmer of hope to your heart, share it. Help it reach people who, like me, desperately need a sign that they're not alone. And if you want to hear more real stories of faith amidst chaos, subscribe. Here, we share scars and miracles. There's an image I carry with me every day: the sunrise in the Sahel desert. The exact moment when darkness surrenders and the horizon is painted orange and purple. A moment so fleeting that it seems to suspend time between night and day, between death and life. Every morning, before I begin my work, I pause before this horizon. I look north, toward Niger, toward Agadez, to the place where I left pieces of myself that I will never recover, but also where I found something far more precious: the certainty that I am not alone. This story isn't just mine. It's the story of Marcos, who survived with his faith intact, despite his broken body. It's the story of Deborah, who sang hymns when words failed. It's the story of Amina, who learned that God not only listens to widows, but walks alongside them. And it's your story too, because we all carry our own chains, maybe not physical, but pains that linger, dreams that died, relationships that fell apart. In these dark places, when the heat of suffering is unbearable and the water of hope has dried up, you may wonder, as I did on that 12th night, is God still here? I can't answer your specific situation. I don't know why some are rescued and others aren't. I don't understand all the mysteries of divine sovereignty. I don't have a perfect theology to explain suffering, but I do have a testimony. And my testimony is that on the darkest night of my life, when all I had left was a desperate prayer and faith the size of a mustard seed, God moved heaven and earth. He created a smoke signal that no one lit, guiding an army to 3 forgotten people in the middle of the desert. If he did it for me, he can do it for you. I don't know what your rescue will be like, or when it will come. Perhaps it will be a grand miracle or a silent grace, perceptible only to your eyes. But know this, he has not forgotten you. Even when the chains seem unbreakable, even when dawn seems impossible, even when your prayer is but a broken cry in the darkness, he is there, moving, working, preparing his smoke signal. 3 years ago, I was chained in a hut, waiting for my story to come to an end. Today, I stand under the African sun, serving refugees, sharing hope, telling this story. This is no coincidence. It is resurrection. And if God can resurrect my story, he can resurrect yours. So I ask you, have you ever felt the weight of invisible chains? Have you ever prayed desperately without knowing if anyone was listening? If so, leave your story in the comments. Because sometimes discovering we're not alone is the first step to true liberation. Your testimony, however painful, could be the smoke signal someone needs to see today. And if this story touched your heart, if any words resonated with you, remember, there is someone around you who needs to hear it. Share it as an act of love, because perhaps this person is living their 11th day, waiting for the 12th, needing to know that rescue is possible. If you want to be part of a community that believes in the power of real testimonies, in faith that never gives up, in the God who saves and rescues, sign up. Let this story be a reminder. God continues to move armies, even when we can't see them. Thank you for staying this far, for listening, for believing. I am Josué da Silva, survivor of Agadez. If I could free myself from the chains that bound me, you can free yourself from yours too. Faith isn't measured by the days you have. It's measured by the days you continue to believe, even in chains. And believe me, God is preparing your rescue.